Uh, my name's Fiona Davies. I'm a visual artist from Australia. I have come to the Georgian Silk Museum to do a project called Blood on Silk State Silk Museum, because this museum is one of the oldest silk museums in the world, and Georgia is in a very interesting position in the trading routes between the silk trading routes, which is a European concept, and the new trading routes for bioproducts such as blood. Now, the idea of blood and silk being paired together is a bit weird, but it came about because I spent a lot of time with my father when he was in hospital prior to his death. He was in hospital for about 11 and a half months. 4.5 months of that was in intensive care. And in intensive care, which is where you have one nurse to one patient, they have a daily ritual of taking a blood sample. It goes off to be tested, it comes back, the results come back. If the results aren't right, they change the drugs or do something, it goes off again to be tested, it comes back, and this goes on all day. And it becomes a familiar process. It becomes like the choreography of the intensive care ward. After my father died, I did a series of installations about him, or about, not so much him, but about the sort of stories we told each other as a family while he was in hospital. But I located them in places that were important to how he thought about himself. So one was in the first one was in the town both he and my mother grew up in. Then there was in University of Sydney in the School of Physics, and the final one was in Lincoln College, which was in the University of Oxford, which is where Dad did his PhD. The one that was at the School of Physics in Sydney, when I was doing that installation, they had a small museum in the foyer of the building. So physics is a lot about measuring things. So in the foyer they had a whole range of historical items about observing and measuring things, so telescopes and a whole range of things. So while I was developing that work for there, I became aware of this postdoctoral fellow called Dr. Peter Domachuk, who was working to develop an implantable chip made of silk, or made of the element of silk called fibrion. So silk's made of fibrion and sericin, and it's not a complicated process to pull out the fibrion. It's a beautiful material, it's perfectly transparent, humans aren't allergic to it. You can, by how you dry it, you can drive how disposable it is in your blood. Anyway, so what Peter was attempting to do was to make a chip that could go within your bloodstream, so you have one time of insertion. So it's not like a cannula where you have it in your body for a long time to take blood samples, which is always a point of infection, possible infection. Once the chip's gone in and the wound's healed, that's fine. So the intention was that you could be scanned and your blood characteristics would be read, then the drugs changed, you just scanned again. So it's not as invasive, it's not as problematic as taking blood and off to a lab, etc. So Peter, another artist called Leanne Hall, who's a writer, and I formed a collaboration of ideas where we basically started talking about the really interesting things that get thrown up when you put silk and blood together. Both silk and blood are really interesting by themselves, and when you put them together, they are amazingly interesting. So you get all of these sorts of things, like the trade routes for silk and blood overlapping and intersecting.